Hello and welcome to episode 59 of a Plain Accounts podcast series, where every week we come together to discuss the upcoming gospel lectionary passage. We are going through the season of Lent. We just looked at the woman of the well last week, and this week we're looking at John 9, 1 through 41, the healing of a blind man, another popular event in Jesus' life. Today we're honored to be joined with Tim Hahn. He provided our commentary for the gospel passage this week. Tim, would you like to say hi and say a little bit about yourself?
Hi, my name's Tim. I'm associate pastor at Westchester Church of the Nazarene here in Westchester, Pennsylvania, and I'm excited to be here.
Awesome. And Tim,
and you've got something exciting coming up, don't you? Why don't you tell us a little bit about that, Tim?
I've been accepted at the School of Theology at Boston University for PhD studies starting this fall.
Congrats, man.
Will you be moving there, Tim?
Yeah, we'll be moving end of July, beginning of August to Boston.
Incredible. Well, congratulations, and we're really glad to have you here. And Danny, I'm sort of excited to have you along too.
Meh, whatever.
Well, today is no short text, so why don't we jump in and read our gospel lection. It's John 9, verses 1 through 41. And pay close attention to the structure of this passage. We'd like to speak a little bit to the English structure of this in our podcast together. So let's pay attention to how this is structured and what sort of theological perspective it gives. And then we'll dive in and give some context, hopefully, to this passage. John 9, 1 through 41. This is from the New International Version. As he went along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" "Neither this man nor his parents sinned," said Jesus. "But this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. As long as it is day, we must do the works of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world." After saying this, he spit on the ground, made some mud with his saliva, and put it on the man's eyes. "Go," he told him, "wash in the Pool of Siloam," which means sent. So the man went and washed and came home seeing. His neighbors and those who had formerly seen him begging asked, "Isn't this the same man who used to sit and beg?" Some claimed that he was. Others said, "No, he only looks like him." But he himself insisted, "I am the man." "How then were your eyes opened?" they asked. He replied, "The man they call Jesus made some mud and put it on my eyes. He told me to go to Siloam and wash. So I went and washed, and then I could see." "Where is this man?" they asked him. "I don't know," he said. They brought to the Pharisees the man who had been blind. Now the day on which Jesus had made the mud and opened the man's eyes was a Sabbath. Therefore the Pharisees also asked him how he had received his sight. "He put mud on my eyes," the man replied, "and I washed, and now I see." Some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not of God, for he does not keep the Sabbath." But others asked, "How can a sinner perform such signs?" So they were divided. They then turned again to the blind man. "What have you to say about him? It was your eyes he opened." The man replied, "He is a prophet." They still did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight until they sent for the man's parents. "Is this your son?" they asked. "Is this the one you say was born blind? How is it then that now he can see?" "We know he is our son," the parents answered, "and we know he was born blind. But how he can see now or his eyes were opened, we don't know. Ask him. He is of age. He will speak for himself." His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders, who already had decided that anyone who acknowledged that Jesus was the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. That was why his parents said, "He is of age. Ask him." A second time they summoned the man who had been blind. "Give glory to God by telling the truth," they said. We know this man is a sinner. He replied, whether he is a sinner or not, I do not know. One thing I do know. I was blind, but now I see. Then they asked him, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? He answered, I have told you already, and you did not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to become his disciples too? Then they hurled insults at him and said, you are this fellow's disciple? We are disciples of Moses. We know that God spoke to Moses, but as for this fellow, we don't even know where he comes from. The man answered, now that is remarkable. You don't know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners. He listens to the godly person who does his will. Nobody has ever heard of opening the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. To this they replied, you were steeped in sin at birth. How dare you lecture us? And they threw him out. Jesus heard that they had thrown him out, and when he found him, he said, do you believe in the Son of Man? Who is he, sir? The man asked. Tell me so that I may believe in him. Jesus said, you have now seen him. In fact, he is the one speaking with you. Then the man said, Lord, I believe, and he worshipped him. Jesus said, for judgment I have come into this world, so that the blind will see, and those who see will become blind. With him heard him say this and asked, what? Are we blind too? Jesus said, if you were blind, you would not be guilty of sin. But now that you claim you can see, your guilt remains. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Now, the rule is whoever has to read a long passage doesn't have to talk the rest of the episode. So you guys
just
That's a long one.
That is a long one. A lot is going on here, and we are not going to claim to be able to tackle all of the elements in a 30-minute episode. But what are some of the key things that we should probably focus on as we prepare to preach this text? What are some of the cultural, theological elements that we should probably focus on?
Well, I think that, I don't know, cultural, but certainly narrative, blindness is operating in a fascinating way in this text, right?
Absolutely.
Not only do we have a blind man at the beginning, but at the end we have a formerly blind man and men who claim to not be blind being pronounced blind by Jesus. So we have these two different trajectories of the character text, moving from no sight to sight and from sight to no sight.
In the words of Michael Scott, well, 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 how the turntables. Go on, Tim.
I was not prepared for the Office reference. I'm sorry. Where were we? Oh, yeah. So the sort of
the trajectories that are different.
Blindness and sight, right? And there's layers, both of physical sight. Jesus is talking about being the light, about it being nighttime. There's the man who cannot see and then can see from a physical standpoint. And then there's this, for lack of a better term, spiritual blindness, right? Where the formerly blind man is increasingly able to identify Jesus and moves from the man who gave me my sight to prophet to he is from God and finally to worshiping the Lord. And then we have the Pharisees, right? Who are healthy men. According to the code of Jewish law, they must be healthy men. And they move from being divided as to who this Jesus person is to being convinced that he is a sinner to being pronounced blind by him and guilty of sin. So blindness is going on.
Absolutely. Yeah, that was probably one of the strongest themes throughout this entire passage is how John presents blindness. And even like you don't have an argument between the Pharisees and Jesus. I guess you could call that towards the end, but really it's between the man who is healed and the Pharisees, and their arguments over how they should see this, and not necessarily taking a step back and even questioning, are we seeing this right? They're saying, how should we see this in regards to what we already believe to be true?
Right. Yeah.
Well, and jumping off of kind of a similar theme to what we had just this last Sunday with the Samaritan woman. We see the self-revelation of Jesus coming to the wrong people once again, right? Like, this isn't who you reveal yourself to when you're the Messiah. You do it in the temple. You do it to the teachers of the law. You don't reveal your messianic status to a woman at a well in Samaria, because that looks too much like a marriage proposal. And you don't do it to this man who's been born blind, because according to Second Temple Judaism, which would have been steeped in kind of this, what we might call health and wealth gospel, this man is a sinner. And we see that later on, and towards the end of the passage, this ridiculously long pericope, we see the Pharisees say, "You are a sinner from birth," which I want to make a clarification, because that phrase comes directly in contrast to Jesus' phrase at the beginning of the passage. Once again, we see kind of these roles reversed. The passage begins by the disciples pointing out this blind man, saying, "Hey, Jesus, who sinned that this man was born blind, his parents or himself?" Which is assuming the theology of Second Temple Judaism. Your parents sinned or you sinned, and there are these tangible ramifications with your health, with your blindness. He was a sinner. That is what caused his blindness. And most of our translations assume that God has ordained this man's blindness. So, Ben, what you read in the NIV, it said, this happened so that God's works might be revealed in him, right?
Right.
The antecedent of this happened being he was born blind. The NRSV repeats that phrase. Jesus in verse 3, neither this man nor his parents sinned, semicolon, he was born blind so that God's works might be revealed in him, period. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. Now, every grammar, every punctuation, like all of that is added by editors in the original texts. None of the original texts would have had a comma or a period or a semicolon or a question mark or an interrobang, which is a really fun grammatical, which is a really fun end of sentence, which I used in my essay this week. You can check it out in Ephesians. I used an interrobang. But what the Greek does not include is a repetition of he was born blind, or Jesus doesn't say he was born blind, or this happened. That's not in the Greek at all. And it was in a conversation with Dr. Andy Johnson, a professor at Nazarene Theological Seminary, who Tim is sporting today. I see that on his shirt. He references Craig Keister, a scholar, who said perhaps a better translation of verses 3 and 4 is a translation that does not baptize tragedies, which you could title your sermon "Baptizing Tragedies." That'd be a good sermon title. But what they say is it doesn't repeat. Jesus doesn't say he was born blind so that the works of God might be revealed in him. They say a better translation is neither this man nor his parents sinned that he was born blind. Full stop. But in order that the works of God might be revealed in him, comma, we must work the works of the one who sent me. It's not that God ordained, that God desired that this man be born blind so that he can have some type of self-glorification. That's kind of narcissistic. The ends justify the means in that way. What Jesus says is, no. That theology is incorrect. To believe that this man was born blind because of some former sin is not the case. God did not ordain his blindness, but in order for the works of God to be revealed in him, we must work the works of the one who sent me. And so we see Jesus giving, in a lot of ways, a brand new theological perspective for Second Temple Judaism. But then later on, when we get to the end of the passage, we'll see the Pharisees. The Pharisees will promote that theology that Jesus has just debunked. Later on, they say you are a sinner from birth, and that is what Jesus has said from the beginning is an improper theology. which I think is an important thing to note on a Wesleyan podcast about this passage.
Absolutely.
I think we see in most of our translations a very, very heavy Reformed influence on how we interpret this passage. And I love my Reformed friends, but
not to let the Wesleyans off the hook, though.
Right.
Our concern to battle our Reformed brothers, sometimes drives us to bend over backwards in order to excuse God from anything that might be icky from our modern eyes. At the very end of our passage, Jesus doesn't mince words in verse 39. Jesus said, "I came into this world for judgment, so that those who do not see may see, and those who do see may become blind." And he's skipping to 41. Jesus said to them, "If you were blind, you would not have sin. But now that you say, 'We see,' your sin remains." And I was reading out of the NRSV there.
Yeah.
This anticipates some of the teaching of Jesus in the final discourse in chapters 14, 15, and 16 in John, here towards the end of the gospel, where Jesus goes on these often very circular and very confusing explanations about how, because he's shown up, we have no excuse for our sin anymore. And the world is guilty because he has arrived. Now, if he hadn't arrived, Jesus says, then you would not be guilty. But because I mean, it's the same sort of pattern here. And so I don't think, just to play devil's advocate or Reformed advocate, that we can't read the passage without these sort of harsh realities that Jesus says, look, I've shown up and this means everything. And there are negative consequences for some because of my incarnation as well.
Right. Well, and I think to the point at the very end in verse 41, I think one of the things where we Wesleyans kind of miss it is that I think we very often we miss the humility of holiness, right? Jesus says at the very end, if you were blind, you would not have sinned. But now you say, we see, your sin remains. How often do we want to talk about sanctification so badly that, like, I've got it. It is mine. Do we not become then like blind people when we make that sort of a statement? Is there not a paradox to holiness?
Yeah. We see John Wesley's own hesitancy to admit that perhaps an entirely sanctified person who claims to be entirely sanctified might not be entirely sanctified. He can't quite bring himself to say that, but there's definite places where he's not comfortable with claiming it.
I thought I knew a holy man until he told me so himself.
Right. Yeah.
Right? So we see the paradox of holiness right here in this passage.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, going back to the overview, there's kind of a competing dialogue happening with the editorial presentation of this passage where one would say that God's sovereignty is his most darling attribute. His primary foundational nature is his sovereignty. And so then everything, his act, his economy, his will, goes to present his sovereignty and to glorify that in the world. So when you have editorial marks like he was born this way to show God's glory, it's to show his sovereignty, his rule. And we Wesleyans want to say his most darling characteristic is love. So everything that his act, his economy is love. But we can become so bifurcated on that we kind of strip God's love from any sort of sovereignty and then strip his sovereignty from any sort of love. And I think Jesus, even in this English translation of it, shows how this humility is linked with the sovereign acts of God to portray God's loving desire to be in relationship with us. That our vision should be shaped by the love of God towards God and each other. And I don't know if that's tangential, but I think that's kind of a major conversation that's happening in the presentation of this text.
Yeah.
To sort of just jump off from our comments about editorializing and the various theological traditions that we're talking about here, bear with me because I think this has homiletical fruit. This text reveals, or it suggests to us, a good bit of very artful editing in its original form in the Greek here. because we see here not just indications that the story has been edited, for example, the waffling back and forth between calling the Pharisees Pharisees or calling them Jews, but we see this intentional structuring to reflect in the text the experience of the community who would have first received the Johannine text, right? This Johannine community, probably living around the end of the 1st century in the Holy Land, nearby Jerusalem. And they are experiencing increasing division and increasing conflict with their fellow Jews. And so we see here, I think, I'm not saying that this story has been made up by any means, but I think that what we see here is the early church remembering this story of Jesus and the words of Jesus, and they're remembering it through the lens of their experience, which includes real conflict between themselves and the Jews who do not recognize Jesus as the Messiah, and the consequences of that conflict, namely being thrown out of the synagogue, which is something that is going on here in the text. And I promised that this had homiletical fruit, right? So I think that as we recognize this pattern, that what's going on in the story parallels with what's going on behind the story in the early church community, it also parallels, it helps us read our own reality as yet another layer of parallel experience. That we too, because of the incarnation of Jesus, find ourselves at odds in some way, in some form, with the world around us because of who Jesus is and what Jesus's incarnation means for our lives. And so the preacher can almost stack the stories on top of each other. So you can sort of tell the story as it is in the text, and you can retell the story as it would operate in the early church community, as they apply it to their own experience of confrontation with the Jews and the empire, for that matter. Then you can stack that final layer of how this text operates in our lives as we find ourselves confronting our reality and viewing it differently because of this man Jesus. And so I think there's a ready-made avenue for preachers to move from the text to the lived experience of our congregations.
I like that a lot.
Absolutely.
So I think that's a really good stepping point to how does that homiletical fruit look? I guess some of the fruit that I'm thinking of is that can be applied very specifically to our specific circumstances. We can see the ways in which a congregation in Boise, Idaho, for example, might be stuck in their perspective that is only unique to Boise, Idaho, and that a congregation in the Midwest, a congregation in Michigan, is going to see the world in a different light. And so how do we allow the presence of Christ to break us from those things that often cast us not only out of God's presence ourselves, but cast us away from those who need to see, cast us away from those who need to have healing in their life. So the question really could, I liked what you said earlier, Tim, that, shaping your sermon with a title as clear as mud. What sort of complex things are we just avoiding because they may be difficult, or we've just become so used to them in our various contexts?
Yeah. I think that asking, and this is not necessarily a move that you have to make when you read a gospel, but it's helpful to ask, with which character are you identifying, right? And I think that question can have multiple answers, right? Sometimes we're identifying with Jesus. Sometimes we're identifying with those to whom Jesus is ministering. Sometimes we ought to be identifying with the Pharisees. And all the time, I think it's all of the three, right? Together. And so if we use those questions sort of, and as, like I said, the structure for your sermon, as you narrate the levels of the story, you can place the church, the congregation, or you yourself as the preacher, within the different characters in the story. and use the relationship, the drama that's going on in the story to help us understand the world around us. So are we, not to beat a dead horse, but is our Wesleyan identity more important to us than the teachings of Jesus, even the uncomfortable teachings of Jesus? Like, are we like the Pharisees in, verse 29? We know that God has spoken to Moses, but as for this man, we do not know where he comes from. We are disciples of Moses, then, in verse 28. You are his disciple, but we are disciples of Moses. The Pharisees' religious identity, the tradition within which they understand themselves to live and understand and have their being, is preventing them, in this case, from recognizing Jesus, who is the fulfillment of that tradition. I think it's a useful homiletical move, discipleship question to ask, what ways do our preconceived identities, whether it's a theological tradition, whether it's a national identity, whether it's a regional identity, family sort of identities, do they prevent us from recognizing who Jesus is? Are we made blind by those identities?
Right. A big question to ask is, what blinders do we have? Cultural, political, even religious, which is to your point, Tim. Or do we have any religious blinders that prevent us from seeing the new thing Jesus is doing? Something that may have never been done, never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a person born blind. Do we have any blinders? And I think I like to ask this question: what does this have to do with Lent? We're preaching this in a season, and it's chosen for this season. What does this have to do with Lent? And I think if we're to say, I think of this story, this is a similar story to the publican and the Pharisee outside of the temple praying. You find yourself necessarily in a pickle. In that story, you read the story and you say, oh, God, I thank you that I'm not like that Pharisee. And then you're automatically indicted, right? Here, I think if we say, oh, we see better than the Pharisees, we're automatically indicted, right? This is a passage that you cannot escape from being indicted, like, except for confession, except for humility, which I think this is a perfect passage for Lent because it forces us to be confessional. It forces us to acknowledge, I may not see things as I ought. I might have some blinders. And the moment you say, oh no, I get it, I see. Well, that's the moment Christ says to you, well, your sin remains. And so I think this is a beautiful passage for Lent.
Absolutely.
Well, I want to jump in and build off that, because you're absolutely right. And I'll just share, I'll confess my own pastoral experience here just a little bit. A couple weeks ago, I guess it was before Lent technically, but we were getting ready for Lent. We were Lenting for Lent. And I was preaching on, actually, later in John, parts of this final discourse, the end of chapter 15, the beginning of chapter 16, where Jesus promises his disciples that the world's going to hate them. And I spent the first half of that week like loading for bear. I was getting ready to just blast my congregation with how this shows that if the world doesn't hate us, then clearly we're not following Jesus. The implication being like, look at us, all respectable folk here in church, doing relatively well economically. What horrible disciples we are. And I was confronted by the text as well, though, because later on in chapter 16, Jesus turns to comforting, right? Your suffering, your pain that's going to come out as a result of following me is going to be turned to joy, right? There's this reconciliation, this promise of hope that's in that text very much tied to the promise of the Holy Spirit, which is something Wesleyans want to highlight. But sorry, I'm rambling. But I was checked and said, like, look, for all the fact that my congregation is middle class and respectable and, entangled in all sorts of political idolatries, just like we all are, they also are experiencing real pain, like real pain. They too yearn for the promise of resurrection in their lives. And the promise of Lent isn't just the discipline of humility. It's the promise that you who are humble, right, you blind person, Christ has come to give you sight. And so I think that there's the other side of this coin, because Danny, you're absolutely right. This is a wonderful Lenten text for its discipline, but it's also a wonderful Lenten text for its promise that,
Absolutely.
you know, yes, we are indicted by Christ, but there are, I mean, let's give our people some credit. There are plenty of our people who know how desperately they need Christ, who are willing to say, look, I'm blind. I'm the man born in sin. Christ help me, right? And the text says, yeah, Christ has come to give you sight, right? And I think that's a beautiful, to view Lent as a gift, and not just the gift of discipline, but the gift of promise and hope. That's been a challenge that I've been faced with during this season.
Absolutely.
That's awesome. I think in discovering our blindness, one of the things that I've been personally going through is in discovering the ways in which Christ is inviting us to see. You then synonymously understand what you're refusing, what blindness you're refusing to let go of, and that's a sure sign of an idol. You know, like this is really important to me. So how do I navigate this work of faith in order to keep that idol there, or that perspective there, when really Christ may be asking me to back away or abandon that perspective altogether and have it restructured. It's good. Well, are there any other comments, any other things that we should bring up before we bring our episode to a close?
The only last thing I would like to point out is that in talking about sight and blindness throughout this whole incredibly long passage, verse 1 seems to be such an important verse. As he walked along, he saw a man blind from birth. Like, the first person to see in this passage is the Christ. And who is it that he sees? He sees a man desperate, broken, and in need of healing and reconciliation. And he offers that. So maybe we could preach this: Jesus sees you in your hurt, in your brokenness. You are seen by the Messiah.
Then he slinks some mud.
Yeah.
Object. There's an object lesson there for your sermon.
There you go.
Yeah. Throwing mud.
Muddy buddies.
The only last comment I would want to make, I think, that out of my study for writing the commentary this week, I came across the claim, and I didn't double check it, but that this is the longest passage in the Gospel of John where Jesus is absent from the story. Because right at the very beginning, Jesus heals the man, and then Jesus comes back at the very end. Jesus heard that they had driven him out. But in the intervening point, Jesus is not, as a character, is not present in the story. He's being talked about, but he's not there. And I think it's fascinating to recognize that even when Jesus isn't a character in the story is still all about Jesus. And that the progression of the blind man who moves from, there's this man who put mud on my eyes, to he's a prophet, to he is from God, to finally, after encountering Jesus again at the end, worshiping him as Lord, really provides for me this fascinating image of hope. That here's a man who the grace of God was poured out in his life prior to any, confession of faith,
right?
Prior to any mental assent, and that there is a narration, however condensed, of this growth in grace as a result of God's work in his life.
This is the prevenient grace of God on display in this man's life.
Absolutely.
That's good.
That's really good. Well, thank you, Tim, for your work on this commentary and being our guest today. It's always a pleasure having you with us.
Always fun to be with you guys.
Yeah. Well, to all of you who come and view this, preach boldly this week. Follow us on all those social media outlets. Sign up for our newsletter. We're looking forward to some cool new things in the future. If you're going to be at a Young Clergy Conference with Dr. Richard Rohr, we will. Is that how you pronounce his name?
No, I just said woot woot.
Oh, woot woot. I thought you were correcting me.
Nope.
So we will be there in Oklahoma. Danny and I will, and we'd love to chat with you about any things you might love about a plain account and things you might not love about it. And we're always looking for ways to improve and be a good resource for your preaching ministry. So be sure to sign up to receive notifications through YouTube and other things like that to follow what we're doing. Preach boldly this week. May God's grace shed light so you can see in the dark areas of your life. Preach boldly. It's a pleasure being with you.
See you guys.